Our 7th anniversary dinner was at the same restaurant where he had proposed. He had made the reservation himself, which he never did. He had sent me flowers at work that morning, yellow ones, which had always been my favorite. He came home early enough to change and pour 2 glasses of wine before I finished getting ready, and he stood in the kitchen in his good shirt and smiled at me when I walked in and said I looked beautiful. Everything about that evening was exactly right. That was the thing I kept coming back to afterward. Not the moment the evening broke open, not what I found, but how perfect the hours before it had been. How careful, how considered. Like someone who understood that the performance needed to be flawless right up until the point when it no longer mattered. My husband's name is Daniel. We met when I was 26 and he was 28 at a professional conference where we had both been sent by our respective companies and ended up at the same table during a lunch session that neither of us particularly wanted to attend. He was funny in a dry, quiet way that I had to pay attention to catch. He asked me questions and actually listened to the answers. He texted me the next day and asked if I wanted to have dinner sometime. I said yes. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Careful, steady years where I learned him gradually and trusted what I was learning. He was reliable. He was present. He traveled for work occasionally but called every night he was away without me having to ask. He remembered things I mentioned once in passing and brought them up weeks later in ways that made me feel genuinely known. I married him at 28 in a ceremony with 40 people and a reception in a restaurant's private room and a first dance to a song we had argued about pleasantly for 3 weeks before agreeing on. My best friend Claudia was my maid of honor. My mother cried at the right moments. Daniel's father gave a toast that was sincere and not too long. Everything was right. I built my whole adult life on the foundation of how right everything felt. We lived in a city 3 hours from where I grew up. Daniel worked in logistics consulting and traveled 2 to 3 times a month, usually to the same handful of cities where his main clients were based. I worked in marketing for a healthcare company and traveled occasionally, but mostly kept regular hours and built a life that was structured around the 2 of us. We had talked about children for years the way couples talk about things they are moving toward without quite committing to a timeline. We had a house with a room we called the guest room, but both privately thought of as something else eventually. We had a dog named Percy who slept at the foot of the bed and had opinions about everything. The 7th anniversary dinner started beautifully. We ordered things we didn't usually order and shared bites across the table. We talked about a trip we were planning for the following spring. He held my hand on top of the table the way he did in the early years when we still did those things automatically. I remember thinking on the drive there that we had built something genuinely good and that I was lucky, and that the lucky feeling was reliable and not something I needed to question. His phone buzzed twice during dinner. He glanced at it both times and turned it face down. I didn't think anything of it. He often turned his phone over when we were out. He said it was about being present. I had always respected that. He left the table once to use the restroom. He was gone for maybe 7 minutes, which I noticed only because the waiter came to check on us and I was briefly alone. I looked at the candle on the table and thought about nothing in particular. When the check came, he reached for his wallet and something fell out of it onto the floor beside my chair. I picked it up automatically. It was a card, a rewards card for a hotel chain. The name on it was his. The member number was printed cleanly on the front. I would not have thought anything of it except that the program listed on the card was one I recognized because I had once suggested we use the same chain for a trip, and he had said he didn't think the rewards programs were worth it and preferred to book directly. He had said that specifically. Not worth it. Prefer to book directly. The card in my hand had a member tier on it that required significant accumulated nights to achieve. Not the kind of nights you accumulated staying there once or twice. The kind that required consistent, repeated use over an extended period of time. I put the card on the table when he came back. I asked about it in a tone I kept neutral because I did not yet know what I was asking about, and I did not want to sound like something I didn't have evidence to sound like. He looked at the card. Something moved across his face very quickly, and then his expression settled into something calm and explanatory. He said it was from a conference a few years back that had enrolled him automatically. He said he'd forgotten it was in his wallet. He said the tier meant nothing because they enrolled everyone at that level at the conference. He picked up the card and put it back in his wallet. He poured the last of the wine into my glass. He changed the subject to the trip we had been planning. I listened to him talk and smiled when it was appropriate and finished the wine and thought about the specific thing he had said about the hotel program 18 months earlier. Not worth it. Prefer to book directly. I thought about it the whole drive home. I did not confront him that night. I have thought about that choice many times since. Whether it would have changed anything. Whether I would have gotten honesty in a surprised moment that careful preparation later prevented. I think probably not. Daniel was not someone who broke under surprise. He managed situations. It was one of the things I had always admired about him, and it turned out, a skill that operated in multiple directions. I waited until he was in the shower the next morning. His phone was on the nightstand. I had never gone through his phone in 7 years of marriage. The idea of it had always seemed like a violation of something I valued, the implicit trust that was supposed to be the foundation of a marriage like ours. I picked it up. It was not locked. That surprised me. He was a private person, and I had always assumed he locked it even though I had never tried. The absence of a lock felt significant in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. I looked at his messages. Most were ordinary, work threads, a group chat with his college friends, a thread with his mother. Then I found a thread with a name I didn't recognize, a woman's name. The thread was long. The messages in it were not romantic in a dramatic way. They were domestic. They were the kind of messages people send about logistics and schedules and small daily things. What time are you landing? The thing you mentioned is sorted. She is asking about the weekend. I scrolled up. The thread went back 4 years. I put the phone down on the nightstand exactly where it had been. I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and listened to the shower running and thought about the word she and what it implied and what the domestic ordinary tone of those messages meant when taken together with 4 years of consistent thread history. I called Claudia from the bathroom with the door locked and the fan running. Claudia had been my closest friend since university, and she was the kind of person who absorbed information without immediately reacting to it, which was what I needed. I told her what I had seen in the approximate words I had available, which were not many because I was still assembling the shape of the thing. She said she was coming over. I told her not yet. I told her I needed more information before I could have a conversation about any of it. I said I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I said it out loud in full sentences. She said she understood and to call her the moment I needed her. Daniel left for work at his usual time. He kissed me on the cheek in the kitchen and said he'd be home by 7 and asked if I wanted him to pick up anything on the way. I said no. I smiled in the way I had apparently been smiling for some amount of time without knowing what I was smiling over. I went to work. I sat at my desk and opened a spreadsheet that I did not look at. I thought about what I knew and what I needed to know and how to find it without alerting him that I was looking. I started with the things that were accessible to me legitimately. Our shared finances. We had joint accounts for household expenses and separate accounts for personal spending, which we had agreed on early in the marriage as a way of maintaining some individual financial autonomy. I had full access to the joint accounts and had never paid particular attention to his personal account because it was his personal account. I pulled our shared account history going back 2 years. I was not looking for anything in particular. I was looking for patterns I had not previously examined. I found them. Daniel contributed a fixed amount to the joint account each month, as agreed. The amount never varied. But I could see from the transfer records that his personal account had consistent large withdrawals on a pattern that did not match anything I could account for. They happened roughly every 3 to 4 weeks, usually on the Friday before a week he was scheduled to travel. I mapped his travel schedule against the withdrawal dates. They aligned almost perfectly. I sat with that for a long time. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Not a divorce lawyer specifically. I called a general family law attorney named Miriam, whose name I had found through a colleague who had used her for a different matter. I did not tell Miriam what I suspected. I asked her, in broad terms, what a person's rights were in terms of accessing financial information within a marriage. She explained what was available to me legally and what I would need her help to access if it came to that. I thanked her and said I would call back if I needed to proceed. That evening Daniel came home at 7 as promised and made dinner, which he did 2 or 3 times a week because he genuinely enjoyed cooking. He made something with pasta and described the process while I sat at the kitchen counter and watched him and understood that I was watching a person I did not fully know. Not because he had changed, because I was seeing him differently now, with information I hadn't had before, and the difference was in my perception, not in him. He had been exactly this person the whole time. I had just been looking from the wrong angle. I kept looking from the right angle for 2 more weeks before I found enough to know what I was dealing with. Her name was Isabel. She lived in a city 2 hours from ours, one of the cities Daniel traveled to regularly for work. They had been together for 5 years. They had a daughter together who had just turned 3. Our anniversary dinner, the flowers, the good shirt, the held hand across the table had happened 4 days after his daughter's 3rd birthday. I sat with that fact for a long time before I let myself feel it. I told Claudia everything on a Saturday afternoon while Daniel was at a work event he had mentioned 3 days in advance with his usual transparency about his schedule. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said it was worse than she had imagined when I called her 2 weeks earlier from the locked bathroom. I told her I thought so too. What I had pieced together over those 2 weeks was not a story of passion or accident or a brief lapse in judgment that had compounded into something complicated. It was architecture. It was a structure Daniel had built deliberately with attention to detail over 5 years and maintained with the same quiet reliability he brought to everything else in his life. Isabel had moved to her city 3 years before Daniel and I met. They had known each other before me. She was not the result of something that happened during our marriage and then grew. She was someone who had existed in his life before I entered it and continued to exist in a separate compartment while our marriage was being built. I had found enough through public records and the limited information visible on social media to understand the outline. A daughter named Maya. An apartment in a neighborhood Daniel had mentioned visiting for a client. A life that ran parallel to ours on a schedule Daniel had managed for 5 years without a single visible crack. The hotel rewards card. I thought about it differently now. He had not been careless the night it fell out of his wallet. He had accumulated enough nights at that property that the tier was automatic, a fact of the account that existed regardless of whether he wanted it to. The card had been in his wallet probably for months. He had simply never had occasion to use it in front of me before that night. The crack was not carelessness. The crack was time. Claudia asked me what I wanted to do. She did not tell me what I should want to do, which was one of the reasons I had called her instead of someone else. I told her I wanted to understand everything before I did anything. I said making a decision this significant on incomplete information would be a mistake, and I was not prepared to make that mistake. She said she understood and asked how she could help. I called Miriam the following Monday and retained her. She was precise and unemotional in a way that was exactly what I needed. She laid out what I was entitled to in terms of financial disclosure and what the process looked like if I chose to proceed with divorce. She did not rush me toward any conclusion. She said her job was to make sure I understood my options and my position so that whatever I decided it clearly. I asked her about the child. She explained the legal dimensions of that situation carefully. The existence of a child Daniel had fathered during our marriage had implications for our financial settlement that I needed to understand. Not punitive ones, just real ones. She said knowing the full scope of the financial picture was important before any conversation happened with Daniel. I spent 2 weeks with Miriam gathering the complete picture. She had resources I didn't have and accessed information through legitimate legal channels that would have taken me months to find on my own. By the end of those 2 weeks, I understood the full architecture of what Daniel had built. He had maintained 2 households financially for 5 years. His income was higher than I had fully understood because he had not disclosed a portion of it to me when we set up our financial arrangement in the early years of marriage. The undisclosed income went directly to a separate account I hadn't known existed. From that account, he funded Isabel's apartment, his own costs during his visits, and the expenses associated with Maya. He had done this methodically. The amounts were consistent. The accounts were separate enough that nothing flagged in our shared financial life. He had built a second life the way a careful accountant builds a second set of books. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a parallel structure that ran quietly alongside the visible one. My colleague at work, a woman named Bernadette who had worked in the same department for 8 years, noticed something was different about me during those weeks. She didn't ask directly. She brought me coffee one afternoon without explanation and said she was around if I needed anything. I thanked her and meant it. I did not tell anyone at work what was happening. I came in every day and did my work and answered my emails and sat in meetings and contributed when I was supposed to contribute. The professional surface of my life stayed intact. I needed it to stay intact because it was one of the things that was genuinely mine, and I was not going to let it become collateral damage in something Daniel had created. Percy the dog slept on my side of the bed during those weeks. He had done it before occasionally, but during that period he did it every night, like he understood that something had shifted in the house and was positioning himself accordingly. I appreciated it more than made rational sense. I had the full picture by the end of the 4th week after the anniversary dinner. Then I made an appointment with Daniel. I called him while he was at work and asked if we could have dinner at home on Friday evening. He said of course and asked if something was wrong. I said I wanted to talk about some things and I thought home was better than a restaurant. There was a pause before he said that sounded good. He heard something in the way I said it. I was sure of it. But he didn't ask more and I didn't offer more, and Friday was 4 days away. I spent those 4 days being exactly who I had always been with him because I had learned, from watching how he did it, that the performance could stay clean right up until the moment it no longer needed to. I set the table properly before he got home. Plates and glasses and the cloth napkins we used for company. Not candles, just the regular overhead light, turned low, because that was the light that made the kitchen feel like a room where serious things could be said without the stiffness of a formal setting. Daniel came in at 6:30. He had brought wine, which he did sometimes on Fridays without prompting. He set the bottle on the counter and read the room the way he always did, quietly and without showing that he was doing it. He asked how my day was. I said fine and asked about his. We sat down to dinner. I had cooked something straightforward because I hadn't wanted to spend the afternoon managing something complicated on the stove while managing what I was about to do. I waited until we were through most of the meal. Then I put down my fork and said his name. He looked at me. I told him I knew about Isabel. I told him I knew about Maya. I told him I knew about the account he had maintained separately and the apartment and the schedule he had run for 5 years. I told him I knew the amount he had contributed each month and roughly when it had started. I did not say it dramatically. I said it the way Miriam had taught me to deliver information I had built a legal record around. Clearly, specifically, without gaps he could fill with his own version. He went very still. That stillness lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then he exhaled slowly and put his own fork down and looked at the table. The man who had managed every situation I had ever seen him face, who had held a performance together for 5 years across 2 separate lives in 2 separate cities, had nothing to manage his way through in that moment because the information I had was complete enough that there was no version he could offer that would change its shape. He said he was sorry. I told him I had heard that word used to mean many things and I needed to understand specifically what he was sorry for before I responded to it. What came out over the next 2 hours was more than I expected and less than I deserved. He was honest, I thought, or as honest as a person can be when honesty is the only remaining option. He told me that Isabel had been part of his life before me. That when he and I met and became serious, he had tried to end things with her. That he had not managed it. That she had become pregnant, and he had made a decision he understood was catastrophic and proceeded with it anyway, because he did not know how to choose and so chose to defer the choice indefinitely. He said he had told himself it was temporary, that he would find a way to resolve it that didn't destroy everything, that he kept waiting for the right moment to do the hardest thing, and the right moment never came and the years accumulated instead. I asked him if he loved her. He said yes. I asked him if he loved me. He said yes. I told him I understood that both of those things could be true, and that neither of them changed what he had done or what it meant. I asked about Maya. He talked about his daughter for the first time with me. This person who was 3 years old and had his eyes according to the photograph I had found. His voice changed when he talked about her, became more careful, more exposed. It was the most unmanaged thing I had heard from him in the entire conversation and possibly in our entire marriage. I felt something about that. I am still not sure what to call it. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I had already spoken with a lawyer. I told him the process was going to be straightforward and I expected us to handle it like adults. I told him I was not going to make this more complicated than it needed to be, and I expected the same from him. He said he would do whatever I needed. I told him I needed him to leave the house that night, not permanently yet, because the logistics needed to be managed properly through Miriam and his own lawyer. But that night I needed him to stay somewhere else. He packed a bag and left within the hour. He stood at the door before going and said my name like he was going to add something to it. Then he didn't. He just said it once, like a period at the end of something. I closed the door behind him. I sat on the kitchen floor with Percy for a while because the floor felt like the right place to be. He put his head in my lap and I held him and looked at the table with the cloth napkins and the wine he had brought and the 2 plates that needed to be cleared. I called Claudia. She answered on the first ring. She said she was already on her way and had been waiting for the call since the afternoon. She arrived 20 minutes later with food she'd picked up and sat on the floor beside me without asking why I was on the floor. We stayed there for a long time. She said she was furious at him. I told her she was allowed to be. She said she was also furious on behalf of Isabel, who had apparently been building her own version of a life with a man who belonged to someone else. That was the thing I had thought about the most in the 4 weeks between finding out and Friday evening. Isabel. A woman who had been involved with Daniel before I existed in his life. A woman who had a child with him. A woman who may or may not have known about me the entire time. I did not know her version of the story yet. I was going to have to find out eventually. The divorce took 11 months. Miriam handled it with the same precision she brought to everything, and Daniel's lawyer was cooperative, which Daniel had promised and delivered. There were no contested assets because I had the complete financial picture and Daniel knew it and seemed to understand that contesting anything would only extend a process. He was as motivated as I was to finish cleanly. The house went to me. I had brought more equity to the purchase and Miriam structured the settlement to reflect that. Daniel took his personal belongings and a portion of the joint savings we had accumulated and left the house the way he had entered my life, quietly and in good order. I changed the locks the week after he moved his things out. Not because I thought he would come back uninvited. Because I needed the physical act of changing them. Claudia stayed with me for 2 weeks after the Friday night conversation. She slept in the guest room and made coffee every morning and did not require me to perform any particular emotional state. She let me be whatever I was on any given day, which varied considerably. Some days I was functional and clear-headed and able to work and cook dinner and walk Percy without anything breaking through. Some days I sat on the bathroom floor for 15 minutes before I could motivate myself to begin. Claudia treated both kinds of days with the same matter-of-fact presence. She did not try to accelerate my processing or redirect my attention towards silver linings. She just stayed. That was the whole thing. She just stayed. My manager, a level-headed man named Philip, noticed the shift in my capacity at work and had a quiet conversation with me in his office where he said I could take whatever time I needed and that my position was secure and he hoped I was okay. I told him the short version and he nodded and said to let him know if anything needed to be adjusted in the short term. Bernadette brought me coffee again without being asked, several times. She never made it a thing. She just put it on my desk and kept walking. Small kindnesses like that carried a disproportionate weight during that period. I contacted a therapist named Sonia 6 weeks after the Friday conversation. A colleague had recommended her 2 years earlier for something unrelated, and I had filed the name away and never used it. I used it now. Sonia was direct in the way I needed and did not mistake directness for coldness. She helped me separate the layers of what I was processing, the betrayal of the specific acts, the disorientation of having my understanding of 7 years restructured, the grief for something that had been real to me, even if it had been incomplete, and the quieter, harder question of what I was going to build next. I thought about Isabel often during those months. I had learned through Miriam's process that Isabel had known about me, not in the early years, but for the last 2. She had confronted Daniel about me when Maya was 1 year old, and he had confirmed my existence and asked her to wait. She had waited. She had made her own choices in her own context, and I was not in a position to fully understand what those choices cost her. I did not contact her. I thought about it. I decided that whatever she and Daniel sorted out between themselves was their territory and not mine to enter. She had a daughter with a man who had been dishonest with both of us. Her situation going forward was going to be complicated in ways that had nothing to do with me. What I focused on was my own territory. The house needed things after Daniel left, not repairs. More like it needed to become fully mine rather than ours. I painted 2 rooms colors I had always liked and he had vetoed for reasons I no longer needed to defer to. I rearranged the furniture in the living room to a configuration I had preferred for years. Small acts of reoccupying a space that had always been half someone else's. Claudia came over on a Saturday 3 months after the divorce finalized and helped me go through the last of the things Daniel had left behind. Not his actual belongings. Those were gone. The residue. A jacket in the back of a closet. A book on a shelf he had bought but not taken. Shared objects that had been ours and were now just objects. We went through everything systematically and Claudia made a pile for donation and I made a pile for the bin, and by the end of the afternoon the house was mine in a way it hadn't been before. I took Percy for a long walk that evening and thought about the restaurant where Daniel had proposed and the anniversary dinner and the hotel rewards card falling to the floor. I thought about how I had carried normal plates into a room that had already been burning for years without knowing the temperature. I thought about the specific feeling of building a life on something real only to discover that the foundation had a hidden room you were never shown. Sonia asked me in our session that week whether I was angry. I told her yes, but the anger was not the main thing anymore. The main thing was something more forward-facing. Something that had to do with understanding what I actually wanted rather than what I had assumed I wanted because it had seemed like the right shape for a life. I was 35. The marriage was over. The grief was real and ongoing and did not have a clean end date. But the house was mine and the rooms were the right colors and Percy slept at the foot of the bed and Claudia had her key and Philip had saved my position and Sonia had a standing Wednesday appointment and Bernadette put coffee on my desk without making it a thing. That was an actual life. Imperfect and incomplete in the way all actual lives are. Daniel called me once, 6 months after the divorce was final. He said he wanted to know if I was okay. I told him I was getting there. He said he was glad. The call lasted 4 minutes and neither of us had anything more to say than that. I thought about what Sonia had asked, whether I was angry. What I felt on the call with Daniel was not anger anymore. It was something closer to clarity. The kind that only comes after you have spent a long time in confusion and come out the other side knowing exactly what happened and what it cost and what it didn't actually take from you. It didn't take the house. It didn't take Claudia or Percy or Bernadette's coffee or Sonia's Wednesday appointments. It didn't take the rooms painted the right colors. It didn't take my work or my competence or my ability to build something. It took 7 years of a story I thought I knew and replaced it with a true one. The true one was harder, but it was mine. I was going to build the next part from exactly where I stood with exactly what I actually had. That turned out to be more than enough.